Hey YouTube, how's it going? Kevin Cleary here with a knife video for you. And today I want to ask the question, what difference does it make? And what I mean by that is, we all in reviews, you've all heard it, you've all read it online, you've all had discussions about it maybe in forums, about different features of knives. Maybe it's the blade shape, or the blade grind, or the blade length, or the handle material, or the way the clip functions, or the way the lock functions, or whatever else. I want to go through some of the big key topics that seem to get focused on in YouTube videos by myself, including others, and just ask the question, what difference does it make anyway? Okay, you know, some of us tend to fixate on things that we just like. For me, I know I love hollow grinds. Okay, now I've got a bunch of knives here and not a lot of them have hollow grinds, so I don't really follow my own rule. But that betrays the question I'm asking here, right? You know, I tend to like knives that have a hollow grind, but really, does it make a difference? Am I gonna not buy a knife because it doesn't have one? Am I gonna say a knife is no good if it doesn't have one? No, absolutely not. Okay, yes, is it something that I like to see? So on a knife like this, the Real Steel H6. Yeah, I love that it has a hollow grind. I love that it has a finger choil. Those things are nice, but how necessary are they? And if you're watching a review, should you see that and go, oh, no hollow grind? Forget it. I'm not buying that, because Kevin's always saying hollow grinds are a big deal. Well, to be honest, they're probably not that big of a deal, right? In fact, I have tons of flat ground knives here, like the Rat 1 and you know, my Kaiser Roach, and a number of others that don't have a hollow grind, and I still love them and I think they're great knives, okay? Recently I picked up the Lion Steel, and it's not a hollow grind, and again, I think it's a really awesome knife. So, before I get into talking about the specific things that I want to address, what I'd love to hear from you guys is, what is the stuff that makes you crazy? It may not even be a big deal. I heard one guy say in forums one time, I will never buy an orange knife. That safety orange drives me insane. I just hate it so much. And he'll never buy one. Well, you know, the color of the handle doesn't affect the usefulness of that knife in any way, but for that particular individual, it was just a deal breaker. And I think we all have them, okay? So let's go ahead and get into this. And I've kind of organized this, but I haven't really. So there'll be a little bit of rambling here. Bear with me, but let's start off with the blade, okay? So you got a knife blade. This beautiful Spyderco Domino has a high flat grind on this very nice CTS 204P blade. What difference? We always, you know, every reviewer is going to tell you what the blade shape is, what the steel is. They're going to tell you what the edge geometry, or a lot of guys are going to talk about what the edge geometry is like. Is it a slicey blade? Is it really more of a tougher blade? What's the story? So let's start off by pointing out that whether it's hollow grind or flat grind, whether it's a high flat grind or a medium flat grind or a saber grind, one of the things that is going to make a difference is how thick that blade is. So on something like the Lion Steel, that's why I've got it here, this Lion Steel has pretty thick blade stock, right? Both of these have similar sort of leaf-shaped modified drop point blades. They're both full flat grind, but the Lion Steel is much thicker blade stock than the Spyderco, okay? And because of that, it's not quite as thin behind the edge. The Spyderco is definitely thinner, and it's going to slice a little better. Now, I will say this is a lot better than a lot of the Lion Steels I've had. In fact, I'd say this is a pretty good trade-off between edge geometry and toughness, but how thick that knife is going to make a difference. Now, what about, let me show you a knife where you can really notice it. So in this Schrade SCH F55, this blade is extremely thick. Let me bring the Lion Steel back for a second. You can see those side by side, right? The Schrade is quite a bit thicker than the Lion Steel. And this is one of the complaints I've got about this knife. It does have a pretty thick edge. Okay, so yeah, it's going to be tough, but you're moving a lot of material. This is a real wedge-shaped blade, and you can see just by the distance, by the size of that secondary bevel, that there's a lot of steel here, okay? Now, that is going to have an impact on cutting performance. It absolutely is. That's one of the reasons, I've talked about this before, but in fixed blades, I really like my SC6, my SC3. They tend to have thinner grinds than a lot of sort of outdoor survival style knives, and because of those thinner grinds, they are a little more versatile. You can get away with doing some slicing tasks and other things other than just chopping at stuff. All right, so how thick is that blade? That makes a difference. It really does. Whether it's hollow ground, flat ground, whatever, the overall dimension of that blade is going to have an impact, okay? Something like that charade that I showed you a second ago, okay, is going to be, these are both nearly full flat ground blades, okay? This one is going to slice about 10 times better than this one because this is such thick blade stock, all right? Now, there are other advantages to thick blade stock, and you have to decide whether you want to make that trade-off or not. Okay, what about the hollow ground? Let's speak to that just a little bit. So here are a couple of sort of budget-friendly knives. In fact, I've done a comparison between the two of them. You've got a full flat grind here, you've got a hollow grind here. I personally, from my own experience, have found that this one slices a little better. It does have thinner edge geometry, and that's one of the things that a hollow grind allows. You can really get that down to a thin amount of steel down here, which makes it slice really, really well. And for most EDC tasks, we're not cutting through a large amount of material, okay? I know we all cut cardboard for testing, and you've seen a lot of YouTubers do that, but most people, if they're breaking down boxes, they're just gonna cut the tape and fold the box down. They don't actually cut it up. Okay, and so that means you're not putting this whole blade through something very often. Maybe you cut an apple in half, right? And something as soft as an apple is not going to make much difference anyway. Hollow grind, does it make a difference? Yes, it makes a difference, but it's a fairly small difference, okay? I would suggest, if we put these both in a machine that could push down and test how hard it is to push it through material, they would be fairly close, okay? Yes, you're gonna get some binding from a hollow grind as well, especially as you move through material. So, it's one of those things, as I said, that's really not the end of the world, but we sometimes make a big deal out of it. What largely matters is how thick the blade is and what kind of edge geometry. Is it a lot of steel behind that very fine edge at the bottom? Is there a ton of steel back there? Or is it fairly thin? Let's go on then and talk about blade steel, all right? Cold Steel has switched its blade steel over from the Aussate steel to CTS XHP. Great move. Now the hardness is not super, super high on these Cold Steels. I've said that before, but if you've got, for example, my Southern Midtech is CTS XHP, and it's considerably harder and it holds an edge longer than any of my Cold Steels, okay? So that makes a difference. But blade steel, what does blade steel impact? Well, it impacts how long that knife is going to hold an edge, how easily it's going to rust, what kind of dullness it's going to take. So a harder steel is going to chip easier, a softer steel is going to be more likely to roll and less likely to chip. But part of that, now, when you start thinking about this, one of the things that matters is what the intended use of that knife is. The Aussate in this Rat Model 1 is a fairly soft steel. It's more likely to deflect than it is to actually break. Well, this is intended for some pretty tough outdoor use type of stuff. So would you rather have this knife bend a little bit without snapping, or would you rather have it break completely? Well, obviously you'd rather have it bend a little bit. 1095 spring steel is, of course, what a lot of survival knives are made out of, okay? And that steel is what they favor in survival knives is toughness. So they want this steel to not be a chippy steel. They want it to be a steel that would rather bend or roll than break. Okay, but the type of steel you're dealing with is going to make a difference along those lines. All right. Now let me say this: I have quite a few knives in 1095 high carbon steel, different carbon steels. I have quite a few knives in D2 steel, and although they're all prone to rust, they all can rust. Much more than a stainless steel, I have no problem keeping my knives from rusting. Number one, use them. Number two, put a little bit of oil on them and you'll probably never have an issue. Unless you live right on an ocean or you hang all your knives out on your front porch where they're going to be exposed to the environment all the time, you're probably, with just a little bit of care, okay, you can stay away from corrosion. And be a little bit responsible, right? If you know you're going into an environment, like maybe you're going camping for the weekend, or maybe you're going hiking where there's going to be a waterfall that you're going to play in or something like that. Well, if you know you're going to get all your gear wet, then plan accordingly, right? Steel definitely does make a difference. Now, let me say this as well. There are a lot of, CTS 204P is a great steel. Sleipner steel, again, a great steel. CTS XHP, great steel. All of these steels are really, really going to perform well for you. S30V, all right? They're all going to perform well, and probably for the average user, okay? If you don't own a bunch of knives, if you don't sharpen regularly, or you don't sharpen multiple different knives regularly to notice the difference in feel between the steels, you probably are not going to notice a huge difference between a lot of these steels. Really, you're going to be going off of marketing and off reviewer recommendations, okay? So keep that in mind as well. Sometimes blade steel is not as big a deal as you think. Okay, now I will say this. There are some exceptions, there are some considerations along the lines of price point. And the reason I feel that way is because if I know that a manufacturer could buy this steel for dirt cheap, and now they're selling me the knife at a huge, huge markup, I go, yeah, that's not fair. Like, if you're gonna sell me this knife for 300 bucks, it better have steel that is in keeping with that price point. Don't sell me a $300 knife that has AUS-8 steel, right? Because I know that steel is very cheap to buy. And so there is that consideration. It's about, there's a little bit of value that ought to be considered. So that's my talk about blades and blade steels and blade shape. How much do they matter? They matter, but a lot of times it's not as big a deal as we sometimes think, especially for the person who carries a knife, takes it out and makes a couple of cuts a day and then puts it back in their pocket, right? If you're not cutting meat all day or filleting fish or something like that, the blade steel is not going to make as big of a difference. How about handle material? That's another one that always gets mentioned. Pretty well all reviewers across the board are going to favor G10. G10 is a great material. It's very stable. It's very tough. Okay, but when a knife, so let's say the Ontario Rat 1 has these FRN handles, does that mean this knife is no good? Or what about the Pacific Salt? Again, with the FRN handles, and even the Delica, the Endura, lots of knives out there, right? There's a new one coming out from K-Bar, and I was reading the specs, and sure enough, FRN handles. What's the deal? Is it no good now? Should I get rid of it? Well, be aware of what you're, be aware of what you care about, and remember that the product that it's made out of does make a difference, but not often as much as the kind of grip. Okay, so I've got a few blades here. Okay, this is a G10 handle with a G10 backspacer. This is a G10 handle with a titanium backspacer. This is a G10 handle with an aluminum backspacer. This is a G10 handle with stainless steel liners. These are all the same material, okay? But I can tell you that in hand, all of these feel fairly different, okay? These two are probably the grippiest, but so I say that to say that, yeah. So I go into all that to point out that often the texturing and the handle shape is as important, if not more important, than the handle material. Now again, there is that consideration of cost. If you know this is dirt cheap material, why am I paying a lot of high amount of extra for it? That's something to consider. The other thing is your intended use may make a difference. A knife that's has a titanium handle, or I don't have a good example of a stainless steel handle, so you'll just have to take my word for it, or a stainless steel handle, they're going to transmit more heat, okay? A knife that has G10 or FRN or something else is going to be a little more comfortable. The other thing to consider is an all aluminum handle. I should have an example of this, but I guess I don't. But aluminum handled knives are pretty popular and pretty common. The only drawback to aluminum is it can chip. It can mark up pretty easily. And so if it's just a knife you're going to buy and use, who cares? A mark on the handle is not going to be the end of the world. But if it's one you're maybe buying to collect or trade or whatever, then that's a consideration that you might want to take into account. Let's go ahead and talk about lockup. Tons of videos out there. The Apostle has a good one. I've actually had one. a few others, a lot of people, most big YouTubers, and even a lot of small ones like me have done a discussion of locks. Okay, people like the Axis lock, they like liner locks. I do not have an Axis lock example here. I should have had one. Titanium frame lock, you know, all of these are great lock types. Does it matter? And how much does it matter? You know, the reality is a lock is there as sort of a backup, okay? Really, you should treat all folding knives as if they're slip joints. That is, as if they could close on your fingers, and don't use them that way. So don't put negative pressure on this blade. Now, the other side of this is you may have a particular preference about this, okay? You may feel like I only want knives with super strong lock, or you may feel like I only like Axis lock knives, or I only like frame locks or liner locks, or I prefer liner locks to frame locks, just because of ease of use, okay? The reality is, as I said, that lock, the kind of lock is not the end of the world, even though almost everyone would admit that the Cold Steel Triad lock is about the strongest lock you're going to get on a folding knife. That doesn't mean, and I've never heard anyone suggest that that's the only kind of knife you should buy. If it doesn't have a Triad lock, skip it. Well, no, I don't believe that. Really, the only secure, trustworthy lock is, of course, a fixed blade. And if you're doing anything that could cause the knife to close on you, you should be using a fixed blade. Now, one thing related to the lock that I will speak to a little is up and down blade play. So one of the things that I insist on with all of my knives is that they have no blade play. All right, and I have quite a lot of knives, quite a lot of good examples of extremely solid knives at every price point. I have knives that are really solid, that don't have a bit of blade play, that cost $25, and I have them that cost $250, and pretty well everywhere in between. However, so I say that to point out that it drives me crazy if there's blade play, right? Or what drives me maybe even more crazy is if I can get rid of the blade play by tightening the pivot. Here's a good example of this knife came to me from a friend, and he said it's got blade play and I can't get it out, and so I took it apart and cleaned it up and did some things to it, and now it's actually pretty smooth. No blade play. And that's what I expect. That's what I want to be able to see. And if I can't, so let's say he gave me this knife and I was messing with it and doing all kinds of things, I couldn't get the blade play to go away, I would say Spyderco failed to make a good knife in that case. All right, now, this is one of the things I fixate on, so I've got to make an admission here. At the end of the day, if I take this knife out to cut a piece of rope, I cut my rope, or I open my box, or I open my package, or cut up my vegetables for my stew, and there's a little bit of blade play. Does that blade play stop me from doing any of those things? No. So, am I overly sensitive to blade play? Yeah, I think so. Okay, I probably am. And I'll just admit, I can't stand even the slightest bit of blade play. Other reviewers, I've seen other guys talk about, Nut and Fancy is a good example. He'll talk about a knife and he'll say, yeah, there's a bit of blade play, but it's no big deal because, it allows for this knife to function better, to, deploy faster or whatever. I could never say that. I couldn't. It would drive me insane. Okay? So you have to be aware that different people are going to have different emphasis. Nut and Fancy, a good example, he is fixated on weight a lot of the times, right? If it goes over 4 ounces, 5 ounces, forget it, he's not into it. Okay, so let's wrap things up a little bit here by saying, number one, be aware that YouTubers can fixate on stuff. Like you know my preferences, and I try to give those preferences away when I'm reviewing a knife. If I say, look, this has blade play and I hate blade play, even though it doesn't really affect the function of the knife, I just can't deal with it. Or, I don't like the way this clip works. Wait a second, I haven't talked about pocket clips. Hold on, hold everything. You guys know this is a knife I love. It's tip down carry only. Not the end of the world, okay? A lot of times, one of the comments that people will make, now if you're a lefty and this knife can only be right side tip up carry, this one is reversible tip up carry. This one is 4-way repositionable, right? This is, again, for your own comfort. Sometimes it matters, sometimes it doesn't. Let's just leave it at that, okay? I will say I carry this knife, I use it quite a bit, and I can get over the fact that I can't move the the pocket clip, although I kind of wish I could. All right, moving on. Let's kind of wrap things up by saying the main thing is to know the reviewers you're watching, okay? So you know that certain things are going to drive me crazy and it may not be a thing for you. On the other hand, maybe, you know, I'm willing to carry pretty heavy knives, but maybe you're not. And so you'll know, yeah, Kevin thought it was okay, but he likes heavier knives than I do, right? So that I've got to be aware of that. And that's going to be true of most YouTubers, right? They're all going to have certain things that they fixate on and don't like particularly that you maybe don't care that much about. So just be aware. The other thing is here, be aware of yourself. What are the things that you like and dislike? And then you can know that up front and kind of avoid those things. All right, now lastly, I want to point out that this video has been restricted to only things where the knife still functions properly. Okay, I'm not talking about knives that are broken or malfunctioning in some way where they're really messed up. Okay, that would be a subject for a different video. Maybe we'll do a video about common malfunctions and what to do about that, or whether you should just send your knife back, or what to look for, what knives display those commonly. All right, we're going to stop there. Again, I'd love to hear the things that drive you crazy. Also, I'd love it if you'd like and subscribe to this channel, and we'll talk to you soon.